The summer of 1944 was a season of triumph. After months of planning and sacrifice, the Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy and broken the back of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Cities fell like dominoes. German troops retreated in disarray, and for a moment it seemed as though the war in Europe might soon be over. American, British, and Canadian soldiers surged forward with the wind of victory at their backs, pushing ever closer to the heart of Nazi Germany. But just as the Allies reached the German border, their triumphant momentum came to a sudden, grinding halt. Lying just beyond the horizon was a nightmare few had truly anticipated, a barrier of steel, stone, and death stretching nearly 400 miles, the Siegfried Line. Known in German as the West Wall, this labyrinth of bunkers, minefields, tank traps, and pillboxes had been forgotten by many in the chaos of war. To the Allied High Command, it seemed like a relic of a previous era. But to the German defenders, it was their last shield, and they were prepared to make a stand. As soldiers approached this line, they quickly realized they were not just fighting geography or concrete. They were walking into the jaws of a defense system designed to bleed an enemy dry. What followed would be months of relentless combat forest battles in the dark, house-to-house fighting in ruined cities, and valleys echoing with artillery thunder, men froze in foxholes, tanks bogged down in rain-soaked mud, and entire companies vanished into smoke and silence. This was not the easy victory so many had hoped for. This was something else entirely. If you are ready to explore one of the most brutal and overlooked campaigns of World War II, the bloody battles to break the Siegfried Line, then buckle in. From strategic blunders to acts of extraordinary heroism, this is the story of how the Allied forces clawed their way through one of the Third Reich's final defenses. Before we dive deeper, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you won't miss the rest of this powerful series on hidden history and forgotten fronts. Let us uncover the truth together. What the Allied soldiers did not know, what few in the world had truly grasped, was that while they had been marching across France, celebrating liberation and chasing down retreating Wehrmacht units, something ominous was stirring deep inside Germany. Behind the shattered front lines and the chaos of collapsing Nazi positions, an old monster was waking up. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall as the Germans called it, had once stood as a symbol of Hitler's ambition and paranoia. Built in the 1930s as a counterpart to France's Maginot Line, the West Wall stretched from the Swiss border to the Netherlands. It was a vast network of bunkers, tunnels, pillboxes, dragon's teeth tank traps, minefields, and hidden artillery posts. But after France fell in 1940, Hitler had largely abandoned it. The guns were stripped and sent west to defend the Atlantic Wall. The bunkers were left to rot, overgrown with weeds and cracked by time. For years it had sat dormant, a ghost line in the forests and hills of western Germany. Then came August 1944. Normandy was lost, Paris was liberated, and for the first time in years, the German High Command faced the unthinkable: the fatherland itself might be invaded. Hitler, enraged by what he saw as betrayal and weakness, ordered an immediate reactivation of the Siegfried Line. But there was no time for proper reconstruction, and few resources remained. Germany's economy was collapsing under the weight of total war, and the professional engineers and troops who had once built the line were either dead or fighting elsewhere. So Hitler turned to the only manpower he had left: civilians, teenagers, and old men. Over 360,000 people were mobilized men, pulled from factories, elderly veterans of the First World War, and boys barely old enough to shave. The Hitler Youth was pressed into service, wielding picks and shovels where once they had marched with drums and flags. Alongside them, the Volkssturm, Germany's last-ditch national militia, made up of men aged 16 to 60, was sent to fortify positions, lay mines, and drag steel beams across muddy roads. It was a scene out of desperation. Schoolboys digging trenches beside gray-haired pensioners, women filling sandbags while artillery roared in the distance. Entire towns emptied of their last able-bodied men, not to fight, but to build. And yet, in this frantic scramble, something remarkable happened. In a matter of weeks, the dormant Siegfried Line began to stir. Old bunkers were reinforced, new minefields were laid, and the rusted dragon's teeth that lined the fields were reset into fresh concrete. It was not perfect. Many of the fortifications were still in poor condition, and the manpower available could not possibly restore the line to its original strength, but it did not have to be perfect. It only needed to slow the Allies down long enough for reinforcements to arrive, for counterattacks to be planned, for the front to stabilize. That was the true purpose of the Siegfried Line, not to stop an enemy cold, but to buy time. And so, as autumn approached, the Allies found themselves no longer chasing a broken enemy. The Wehrmacht was regrouping, and the terrain had shifted in Germany's favor. The hills and forests of the German frontier were ideal for defense. Roads were narrow, the land was broken and irregular, perfect for ambushes. Visibility was poor, and any advance would be slow and painful. Add to that the maze of bunkers and pillboxes, the minefields buried beneath layers of fallen leaves, and the fact that many German defenders were now fighting with the desperation of men standing on their homeland, and the picture changed completely. What had seemed like the final sprint to Berlin now looked more like a long uphill battle. Allied intelligence had misjudged the speed and efficiency of the German reconstruction. Reports underestimated the number of operational bunkers and assumed the line was still largely in disrepair. They did not account for the zeal of youth groups indoctrinated since childhood or the grim determination of old veterans defending the soil they would fought on in 1914. And then there were the psychological factors. Nazi propaganda had done its work well. Civilians were told the Siegfried Line was unbreakable, that every bunker was a fortress, every trench a final stand. And though the Allies saw through the illusion eventually, they could not deny the effectiveness of the myth in stiffening German resistance. It was not just cement and steel that held the line. It was belief, fear, and fanatic resolve. As the first Allied patrols approached the border regions, they did not find the broken enemy they expected. They found soldiers dug in deep, waiting, prepared, and for every bunker they captured, there were more beyond. The rebuilt Siegfried Line, rough and uneven as it was, had transformed from a forgotten relic into a deadly trap. This was not a continuation of the Normandy campaign. This was something new, a war not of movement, but of attrition. A battle measured not in miles, but in inches and in blood. And the men who were about to fight their way through this wall would soon understand that the real cost of victory was not in how far they could advance, but in how long they could endure. The stage was set. The Allies were about to learn just how much power a desperate nation could wring from the ruins of its last defenses. The first signs that the Siegfried Line would not fall easily came not with a grand offensive, but with the sudden, jarring stillness that met Allied troops as they pushed through the forests near the German border. After the chase across France, marked by fluid movement, collapsing German lines, and the exhilaration of victory, the quiet was unsettling. In the distance, towns like Braunschweig, Monschau, and Aachen lay waiting, their church steeples poking through mist and smoke, their cobblestone streets abandoned, yet eerily untouched. But the moment Allied boots crossed into these borderlands, that silence shattered. Braunschweig was one of the first. Tucked into the rugged Eifel region, it looked like any other sleepy European village from afar. Modest homes, narrow roads, rolling hills. But as the American 3rd Battalion moved in, led by Lieutenant Colonel Teague, the illusion dissolved. The terrain, thick with forests and ridges, funneled the troops into kill zones pre-sighted by German artillery. Machine guns opened from hidden pillboxes disguised as barns or buried beneath the underbrush. Mortars fell from seemingly nowhere, and every step forward triggered a new danger. Booby traps in fences, mines in fields, tripwires across trails. The German defense was not improvised. It was deliberate, methodical, and, above all, patient. These were not broken men in retreat. These were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. SS units with orders to hold the line no matter the cost, and fresh conscripts who knew this fight was now about protecting the homeland. For them, Branchade was not just a waypoint, it was a strong point. And they fought for it with a vicious tenacity that stunned the Americans. Teague's men tried to outflank, to probe for weaknesses, to find gaps in the network of pillboxes and interlocking fields of fire. But everywhere they turned, they met resistance. For 2 weeks, the battalion attacked, pulled back, and attacked again. Each time they advanced a few dozen yards, they paid for it in blood. Supplies had to be hauled through muddy, treacherous trails under constant fire. The wounded screamed for medics who often could not reach them. Reinforcements arrived, only to be chewed up in the same killing zones. And still, the Germans held. Further north, at Aachen, the first major German city to come under direct assault, the resistance became symbolic as much as strategic. Taking Aachen meant breaching the Siegfried Line in a public, undeniable way. It meant invading the Reich. But Hitler had declared Aachen a fortress to be held at all costs, and the German High Command sent some of its best defenders to ensure that declaration became a reality. The battle for Aachen turned into a brutal urban slugfest, unlike anything most American units had experienced. The city's medieval streets, stone buildings, and labyrinthine alleyways became death traps. German defenders had turned cellars into bunkers, attics into sniper nests, and churches into command posts. Every block had to be cleared by hand, sometimes twice. As defenders slipped back in after dark, artillery fire pounded the city from both sides. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and the rubble itself became part of the battleground. Tanks could not maneuver in the debris-strewn streets, and infantry had to fight from basement to basement, stairwell to stairwell, under a constant threat of ambush. Flamethrowers, grenades, and close-quarters bayonet charges became the norm. For the Germans, Aachen was sacred ground, the ancient capital of Charlemagne, a symbol of German history and identity. Losing it would be a psychological blow. For the Americans, taking it was both a tactical necessity and a political message that the Reich itself was no longer invulnerable. It took weeks of grinding combat before Aachen finally fell in October 1944. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The cost in lives was staggering, and the deeper message had already sunk in. The Siegfried Line was no hollow shell. It was a living, breathing defense system, manned by soldiers who fought like they had nothing left to lose. Throughout the Eifel and Hürtgen forests, along the rivers and ridges of western Germany, the story repeated itself. Small villages became fortresses. Quiet hills concealed fields of fire. Every advance became a calculated risk, and every gain was measured not in miles, but in yards. Mines littered the open ground, and snipers haunted the tree lines. Pillboxes, once thought relics of a bygone strategy, proved their worth tenfold. Some had 4-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls and were nearly impervious to anything short of direct artillery hits, and still the Americans came. Division after division rotated through the front, battered and bloodied, only to be replaced by fresh units who would suffer the same fate. Companies disappeared into fog and shell fire, never to be seen again. Entire regiments were pulled back, shattered, and rebuilt from scratch. The Allies had known the Siegfried Line would be a challenge, but they had not expected the sheer savagery of the resistance they encountered, nor the psychological weight of fighting an enemy who believed this was their last stand. The war had changed. This was not France. This was not the celebratory liberation of towns welcomed by cheering crowds. This was Germany, and Germany was not going to give up without a fight. The deeper the Allies pushed into Germany, the more unforgiving the landscape became. The open fields of France, where tanks had thundered forward and air power had ruled the skies, were now far behind. In their place rose the dark, tangled sprawl of the Hürtgen forest, a place that would come to symbolize everything brutal, senseless, and punishing about the Siegfried Line campaign. This was no ordinary battlefield. It was a labyrinth of trees, mist, and mud, where technology and momentum counted for little. and where even the most advanced armies in the world were brought to their knees by the terrain itself. At first glance, the forest did not seem so different from the many others that dotted Europe. But as American troops moved in, they found themselves entering a death trap disguised by nature. The Hürtgen was dense, with fir trees packed so tightly that even sunlight struggled to break through the canopy. The ground was soft, slick with autumn rain and tangled with roots and undergrowth that made every step forward a struggle. Visibility was often no more than a few meters, rendering artillery targeting erratic and air support nearly useless. Maps became unreliable. Radio signals were weak. Even the most basic maneuvers, like coordinating a squad movement or relocating a supply line, were swallowed by the forest. Tanks, which had once been the pride of the Allied advance, now became burdens. The narrow, winding trails were not built for armor. In many places, the heavy Shermans and Pershings sank into the mud or became hopelessly wedged between trees. The Germans knew this, and they exploited it mercilessly. Roads were mined, choke points ambushed, and bridges destroyed. The Americans would clear a path during the day, only to find it booby-trapped again by morning. Worse still, the forest was not empty. Hidden among the trees were German defenders who knew the terrain intimately. They moved like shadows, appearing without warning and vanishing just as quickly. Machine gun nests were concealed behind thick brush. Mortar teams were dug into the hillsides. Snipers waited patiently for hours, picking off officers and medics with chilling precision. Every hill was fortified, every trail potentially lethal. The Americans were not just fighting an enemy, they were fighting the forest itself. Supply lines became nightmares. Jeeps and trucks could not reach the front, forcing men to carry ammunition, food, and medical supplies on foot through miles of hostile woods. Casualty evacuation was even worse. Wounded soldiers often had to be stretchered out over rugged terrain, sometimes under fire, with medics and litter-bearers risking their lives every step of the WWII. Entire companies found themselves cut off, isolated by weather or ambush, sometimes for days, with no contact to the rear and no promise of relief. The psychological toll was enormous. The forest swallowed sound and light, creating a surreal, suffocating atmosphere. Soldiers moved in silence, aware that the enemy could be meters away, yet completely invisible. Paranoia became constant. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch could be the last sound a man heard. Many succumbed not just to wounds, but to exhaustion, frostbite, and breakdown. Morale plummeted. Men began to refer to the Hürtgen as the Green Hell. And still the orders came: advance, hold, dig in. The objectives were unclear, the rewards minimal, but the push continued. General Hodges and the U.S. First Army believed that securing the Hürtgen was vital to protecting the southern flank of the drive toward the Rhine. But in practice, the forest offered little strategic value. The cost, however, was staggering. Over 30,000 American casualties were recorded in the Hürtgen operations, numbers that rivaled the worst battles of the entire war. Yet the Germans paid too. Though better prepared and more familiar with the landscape, they were outgunned and increasingly outnumbered. They rotated units constantly, pulling weary defenders out and replacing them with fresh conscripts, many barely trained. But their defense was never static. They adjusted, improvised, and counterattacked with vicious skill. For every American breakthrough, there was a German counterthrust. For every bunker taken, there was another one waiting beyond. The forest campaign dragged into the winter. Rain turned to sleet, then to snow. Trees shattered from artillery blasts, sending deadly wooden splinters into foxholes. Men dug in for days in frozen ground, their fingers too numb to hold rifles. Uniforms soaked through, boots frozen stiff, weapons jammed from the cold. There was no warmth, no comfort, only the endless pressure to hold ground and press forward. By the time the Americans emerged from the far edge of the forest, they were changed. Exhausted, depleted, and haunted, they had learned the hard way that terrain could be as lethal as any weapon. The Hürtgen had not fallen. It had bled them dry and grudgingly let them pass. It was a cruel lesson, one that commanders would debate long after the war ended. Should they have bypassed the forest? Was the cost worth the gain? In strategic terms, perhaps not. But in human terms, the Hürtgen campaign revealed the depths of the Allied commitment, the will to endure even the most harrowing of trials. It exposed the brutal nature of the wars, a final phase, where every mile came at a staggering cost, and it marked yet another chapter in the long, bloody struggle to break through the Siegfried Line and bring the war home to Nazi Germany. Victory often breeds overconfidence. In the weeks following the liberation of Paris and the collapse of German defenses in France, Allied commanders were flush with optimism. The Wehrmacht appeared shattered. Nazi troops were retreating in confusion. Supply lines were stretched, and Allied forces were racing toward Germany's doorstep with breathtaking speed. It seemed to many in high command that the war might be over by Christmas. That belief would lead to one of the costliest strategic miscalculations of the entire campaign, Operation Market Garden. While American forces were becoming mired in the dense and deadly terrain of the Hürtgen Forest, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed an ambitious plan to bypass the worst of the Siegfried Line altogether. Rather than pounding through Germany's western defenses head-on, Montgomery suggested a bold thrust through the Netherlands. The goal was to capture a series of key bridges over the Rhine and Maas rivers, seize a direct corridor into northern Germany, and open a fast track to the Ruhr, the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The plan, dubbed Operation Market Garden, was audacious in scope. It would be the largest airborne operation in history, involving thousands of paratroopers from the British 1st Airborne Division, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne, and the Polish Brigade. These elite forces would be dropped behind enemy lines to seize key bridges, while a British armored column raced up a narrow highway from the Belgian border to link up with them and punch deep into Germany. It was a gamble, a high-risk, high-reward attempt to break the deadlock and end the war quickly. But it was also a distraction. Resources were diverted en masse, fuel, aircraft, and elite infantry units that could have reinforced the American assaults on the Siegfried Line or supported the grueling campaign in the Hürtgen Forest were instead funneled north. General George Patton, who was pressing for a push through Lorraine into the German interior, saw his Third Army, starved of fuel and ammunition. The offensive momentum that had been building across multiple fronts suddenly stalled as logistical support was redirected to Montgomery's Corridor of Hope. And then, the plan unraveled. On September 17, 1944, Market Garden was launched. At first, the paratroopers achieved a string of early victories, capturing several key bridges and establishing a fragile corridor. But the operation was based on faulty intelligence. Allied planners had underestimated the strength of German forces in the region, particularly the presence of two SS Panzer divisions resting near Arnhem, the very location of the final bridge the British 1st Airborne was tasked to hold. The narrow highway that the British 30th Corps was meant to use became a death trap. German resistance proved far more organized and tenacious than expected. Ambushes, Allied bridges, and fierce counterattacks slowed the armor's progress to a crawl. The British paratroopers at Arnhem, left isolated and under heavy attack, held out heroically for 9 days. But they were ultimately surrounded and decimated. The bridge too far remained firmly in German hands. By the end of September, Market Garden had collapsed. The Allies had suffered over 17,000 casualties, and the route to Germany through the Netherlands remained closed. Worse still, the Germans now had precious breathing room. While Allied forces were bogged down in Holland, the German High Command moved quickly. The failure of Market Garden bought Hitler's forces a vital window to regroup, reinforce, and fortify the Siegfried Line. Troops were redeployed from Norway, Denmark, and even the crumbling Eastern Front. Civilians, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth were conscripted to finish repairs on the bunkers, lay new minefields, and rearm the long, dormant pillboxes. What had once been a static line of rusting concrete quickly evolved into a living, adaptive defense network. In the Hürtgen and Eifel regions, American forces continued to grind forward, but they were doing so without the reinforcements and logistical support they had once expected. Every shell, every gallon of fuel, every replacement unit now had to be carefully rationed. The dream of a rapid breakthrough had vanished, replaced by the slow, costly reality of attrition warfare. Among the troops on the ground, frustration began to spread. They heard stories of the Market Garden disaster, of how critical resources had been wasted in an operation that many considered doomed from the start. They felt the consequences firsthand in the form of empty fuel tanks, delayed artillery support, and the loss of comrades sent north instead of being kept on the front that truly mattered. Commanders, too, felt the sting. Eisenhower, who had reluctantly approved Montgomery's plan, now faced a stalled front, an exhausted army, and an enemy that refused to break. The psychological edge the Allies had gained after Normandy began to erode. German propaganda seized on the failed offensive, portraying it as a turning point, a sign that the Allies were not invincible. The implications went deeper still. By failing to collapse the German western defenses in the critical window after Normandy, the Allies gave the Nazi regime time to prepare its last, most desperate counterblow, one that would erupt in the Ardennes that winter and nearly reverse the course of the war. Strategic missteps are inevitable in any conflict. But Market Garden was not just a failure of intelligence or timing. It was a failure of perspective. In chasing a swift end to the war, the Allies had looked past the brutal challenge directly in front of them. And as the last leaves fell over the shattered trees of the Hürtgen forest, thousands of soldiers continued to pay the price for that oversight, one bloody step at a time. By late autumn 1944, the rain had turned the forest floor into a mire of sticky mud, and the skeletal trees of the Hürtgen forest stood like sentinels over a landscape soaked in blood and despair. For the soldiers of the U.S. Army, this place had become a nightmare beyond comprehension. What began as a tactical push to secure the flank of the Siegfried Line assault had spiraled into a prolonged and punishing ordeal, one that would claim tens of thousands of lives and become one of the most tragic and controversial chapters in the entire European theater. When American commanders first looked at the map, the plan seemed straightforward. The Hürtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile wedge of dense woodland running along Germany's western border, flanked the route toward the vital Ruhr River dams. Control those dams, and the Allies could prevent the Germans from flooding the valley and stalling the final drive toward the Rhine. The forest itself appeared to be nothing more than an obstacle to be cleared, a necessary but manageable task. What it became, instead, was a meat grinder that swallowed entire divisions. The 9th Infantry Division was among the first to enter, tasked with clearing out German positions and establishing a foothold along the edge of the forest. Almost immediately, the men found themselves in an alien world. The trees were packed so tightly that visibility was reduced to a few feet. Artillery fire echoed and reverberated unpredictably through the woods, making it impossible to judge the direction or distance of incoming shells. When rounds exploded in the treetops, they showered the ground below, with jagged wooden splinters shrapnel from the forest itself. Navigating the terrain was a logistical nightmare. Maps were outdated and useless. Roads were narrow, rutted, and mined. Armored vehicles became death traps, stuck between trees, or bogged down in mud, easy targets for German anti-tank squads. Infantry patrols lost their bearings constantly, and supply lines, already stretched thin due to previous strategic diversions, were barely functioning. Ammunition ran low. Medics lacked morphine and bandages. Food arrived late or not at all, and still the Germans held. The defenders were dug in with ruthless efficiency machine gun nests, hidden behind thick undergrowth, bunkers built into hillsides, mortars pre-sighted on every clearing. The Wehrmacht had chosen this battleground carefully. They knew the forest. They had walked its trails in training, plotted its contours on maps for years. They knew where to ambush, where to withdraw, and where to kill. For every ridge the Americans climbed, they found another position waiting. For every pillbox they cleared, another poured fire down from a flanking slope. The casualties mounted. Frostbite, trench foot, and pneumonia joined the ranks of more visible wounds. The psychological toll deepened. Soldiers came to fear the silence more than the gunfire. It meant the enemy was near, watching, waiting. Reinforcements were sent in. The 28th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Bloody Bucket for the red keystone insignia on their helmets, soon earned their name in horrifying fashion. They were thrown into the fight with little time to prepare, tasked with reducing a series of fortified villages within the forest. They were met with storms of mortar fire, collapsing buildings, and ambushes at every turn. One entire company vanished, lost to the trees, and never seen again. Some units suffered up to 70% casualties within days. And still the orders came, press on. Commanders rotated divisions in and out of the line, but none lasted long. The 4th Infantry Division, the 1st, the 8th all suffered grievous losses. Over the course of 5 months, the U.S. Army committed more than 100,000 men to the forest. More than 30,000 would become casualties. For comparison, this was nearly double the American losses during the more famous Battle of the Bulge, which would erupt later that December. And what did it achieve? That was the question whispered among survivors, muttered in field hospitals, and debated behind closed doors at command posts. The forest was never entirely cleared. The Ruhr dams were not captured until months later. No breakthrough came. No great German force was annihilated. The fight in Hürtgen became not a stepping stone, but a sinkhole, a place where initiative, momentum, and lives all drained away. The Hürtgen campaign has since become a textbook example of strategic overreach and underestimation. The terrain nullified the advantages of American mechanization and air superiority. The enemy had prepared it as a fortress, yet the push continued, long past the point of diminishing returns. Some historians argue that the forest could have been bypassed entirely, its defenders left isolated and irrelevant. Others point to the fear of flooded valleys, the need to protect supply lines, or simply the grinding inertia of a war machine that had already committed itself. But for the men who fought there, the justifications did not matter. They remembered the endless woods, the screaming shells, the frozen nights in foxholes filling with water and fear. They remembered seeing friends fall without ever spotting the shooter. They remembered advancing through villages reduced to stone skeletons, fighting for inches, only to be pulled back and ordered to retake the same ground days later. By the time the forest was finally abandoned as an active front in early 1945, its legacy was sealed. The Hürtgen campaign was the longest single battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. It left behind not a victory, but a warning that even the most powerful force in the world could bleed and break when ambition outpaced caution, when terrain and enemy cunning conspired to turn strategy into disaster. The woods still stand today. Visitors can walk the trails, see the remnants of bunkers, the rusted helmets, the markers where so many fell. And if they listen, they might still hear the echoes of the men who fought a war, not just against Germany, but against the very land itself. By December 1944, the Allied armies were bruised and weary. Months of relentless combat had brought them to the very edge of Nazi Germany, but not without cost. The blood-soaked woods of Hürtgen had ground down entire divisions. Market Garden's failure had exposed dangerous cracks in Allied planning, and the Siegfried Line continued to hold stubbornly despite endless assaults. Winter descended like a second enemy. Rivers froze. Roads turned to sheets of ice, and soldiers huddled in foxholes as snow blanketed the shattered forests. In the haze of exhaustion and bitter cold, Allied command allowed itself to believe that the German army was finished. But in the shadows of the Ardennes, Hitler had been preparing one last, desperate gamble. It began just before dawn on December 16, 1944. As the American front lines in Belgium and Luxembourg settled into what many believed was a quiet winter hold, the earth itself erupted in flame and steel. Artillery rained down on the unsuspecting GIs. followed by waves of German armor and infantry pushing through the misty pine forests. The German counteroffensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, had begun. The Allies would come to know it by another name, the Battle of the Bulge. What made the offensive so devastating was its sheer audacity. Hitler had amassed nearly 250,000 troops, over 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of artillery pieces along a 75-mile front, all in total secrecy. He believed that if he could punch through the thin American lines, seize the strategic port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two, he might not only regain the initiative, but force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. It was, in many ways, a fantasy, but for a moment it very nearly became reality. Caught completely off guard, the U.S. forces buckled under the pressure. The Germans exploited fog and low clouds, knowing it would keep Allied aircraft grounded and prevent reconnaissance. In some areas, entire American units were surrounded, overwhelmed, or captured. Roads were choked with retreating convoys and civilian refugees. Communication broke down. Towns and crossroads, places like St. Vith, Bastogne, and Malmedy, suddenly became critical battlegrounds. The terrain once again became a central character in the unfolding drama. The Ardennes was not suited to rapid mechanized warfare, yet the Germans had learned to use the winding roads and thick forests to mask their movements. Their advance carved a massive bulge into the Allied front lines, threatening to rupture the entire Western Front. In Bastogne, elements of the 101st Airborne Division and other support units were encircled, freezing, low on supplies, and outnumbered 5-1. The defenders refused to surrender. When German officers demanded their capitulation, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. The siege of Bastogne would become a symbol of American grit, but it came at a staggering cost. Elsewhere, the Germans committed atrocities that shocked even the hardened veterans of the war. In Malmedy, 84 captured American soldiers were executed by SS troops. The massacre ignited fury across Allied lines and hardened resistance even further. The fight became personal, but the gamble came with fatal flaws. The Germans had underestimated the resilience of the American defense and overestimated their own logistics. Fuel shortages plagued their armored columns. Allied engineers destroyed bridges and clogged roads, slowing the advance. And as the skies cleared, Allied air power returned with a vengeance. Fighter bombers swooped in to decimate German convoys, paratroopers, and tanks exposed in the snow. Reinforcements poured in from all directions. General Patton's Third Army executed a lightning pivot northward, reaching Bastogne in a matter of days. His tanks barreled through the snow and ice, smashing into German flanks and relieving the besieged town on December 26th. The tide began to turn. Through January, the Allies counterattacked ferociously, reclaiming ground mile by mile. The German bulge was pushed back, but not without further bloodshed. By the end of the campaign, more than 19,000 American soldiers lay dead, with another 47,000 wounded and 23,000 missing or captured. It was the largest and bloodiest battle the United States fought during World War II. And though the offensive had ultimately failed, its impact was profound. The Battle of the Bulge delayed the Allied timetable for breaching the Siegfried Line and reaching the Rhine. It drained Allied resources at a critical moment, forced a redirection of troops and supplies, and shattered the illusion that the German army was finished. Worse still, it bought Hitler time to solidify defenses, time to launch last-ditch efforts like the desperate stand at Remagen, and most importantly, time for the Soviets to advance farther into Eastern Europe. For the men who fought in the Bulge, it was a crucible of endurance. Many had survived Normandy, endured the hedgerows, suffered the Hürtgen, but nothing matched the frozen chaos of the Ardennes. They slept in snowbanks, fought through whiteouts, and battled not only the enemy, but frostbite, starvation, and despair. In the end, the German counteroffensive had failed to achieve its grand strategic aims, but it had succeeded in one devastating objective. It turned the final act of the war in Europe into a prolonged and blood-soaked campaign. What might have been a swift march to Berlin instead became a slow, costly crawl, as every mile of ground had to be earned in sweat and sacrifice. The Battle of the Bulge did not stop the Allies, but it reminded them and the world that the war was far from over. Victory would come, but not without enduring one more winter of fire. The winter had been long and merciless. From the frozen hell of the Hürtgen forest to the desperate stand at Bastogne, the Allies had paid dearly for every foot of ground. Snow, blood, and fire had become the new currency of war. Yet by February 1945, the clouds began to break not only in the sky but on the battlefield. The German war machine, battered and drained, was beginning to falter. And now the final act was about to begin. The Allies would strike the heart of the Siegfried Line, once hailed as an impenetrable fortress, and tear it open once and for all. At the forefront of this final assault stood General George S. Patton and his relentless Third Army. Patton had waited patiently, if such a word could ever be used to describe him. For months, his forces had been starved of supplies, sidelined by command disputes and the failed ambition of Operation Market Garden. While Montgomery attempted to drive through the north, Patton had focused on gathering strength in the south, pushing steadily through Lorraine and preparing for a decisive blow. Now, with fresh supplies and a renewed sense of urgency, he saw his chance. His eyes were fixed on Trier, Germany's oldest city, nestled beside the Moselle River, and ringed with Roman ruins that had survived centuries of conflict. But its ancient stones were now embedded in Hitler's war plans. Trier sat behind the Siegfried Line and served as a key transportation hub breakthrough here, and the path to the Rhine would lie open. The Germans were not unaware of Trier's importance. Defensive positions had been reinforced, artillery dug in on surrounding hills, and concrete bunkers buried beneath vineyards. Though their forces were depleted and morale shaken after the failure of the Ardennes offensive, the Wehrmacht still knew how to make the Allies bleed. And Patton was under no illusions this would not be easy. The assault began with methodical intensity. Infantry divisions surged forward across icy fields and cratered farmland, supported by rolling barrages of artillery and dive-bombing fighter planes. Every village en route to Trier became a stronghold, each crossroads a killing field. German snipers lurked in attics and church towers, while engineers turned roads into death traps with mines and booby traps. American tanks clawed their way through the narrow lanes, often ambushed at close range, forced to fight house to house in towns reduced to smoking rubble. But unlike the struggles in Hürtgen or the stalls at Aachen, this time momentum stayed with the Americans. Patton's strategy, refined and aggressive, was designed for speed and surprise. His armored spearheads moved in tandem with infantry columns, probing weak spots, exploiting gaps, and bypassing pockets of resistance to prevent German units from regrouping. He was not looking to inch forward. He wanted to break the spine of the enemy. By early March, the Third Army had reached the outskirts of Trier. What followed was 3 days of savage urban warfare. Artillery softened the edges of the city, but the Germans held tight, falling back from street to street, building to building. Patton's men fought through centuries of stone, clearing snipers from cathedral bell towers and machine gunners from wine cellars turned bunkers. Flamethrowers roared down stairwells, grenades bounced off cobblestones, and tanks rumbled down narrow alleys barely wide enough for their tracks. It was brutal, but by March 1st, Trier was in American hands. The flag went up, and Patton sent a telegram to headquarters, "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. What do you want me to do? Give it back." It was vintage Patton, sharp, sarcastic, and triumphant. But even as the dust settled over Trier, he was already looking east. The Moselle River was no longer the final barrier, it was the Rhine that called. The legendary river had protected the German heartland for centuries. It had stopped Napoleon. It had symbolized the boundary between the West and the Reich. Crossing it would mean entering Germany's soul, and it would mean the war was truly in its endgame. Patton moved quickly, pressing his forces toward the Rhine through the Eifel region. Bridges were scarce and heavily defended. The terrain was rugged, the weather uncooperative, and German resistance, though faltering, remained fierce. But with Trier behind him and morale soaring, Patton refused to yield his momentum. Where the enemy had pillboxes, he brought airstrikes. Where the roads were mined, engineers cleared paths under fire. Where resistance stiffened, he punched harder. Meanwhile, to the north, fate intervened in the Allies' favor. At Remagen, American troops of the 9th Armored Division stumbled upon the Ludendorff Bridge intact. The Germans had wired it for demolition, but failed to bring it down in time. Seizing the moment, U.S. troops rushed across, securing the first bridgehead over the Rhine. The impossible had happened. The river that had shielded Germany now lay breached. Inspired by the breakthrough at Remagen and emboldened by his own momentum, Patton would not be outdone. Within days, he launched his own crossing further south, forging a path through the crumbling Siegfried Line and sending waves of tanks and infantry across the Rhine. The last great natural barrier had fallen. By the middle of March, it was clear that Germany's western defenses had collapsed. The Siegfried Line, so long a symbol of Nazi defiance, was nothing more than scattered ruins. The fortresses had been stormed, the Dragon's Teeth bypassed or buried beneath tanks, and the bunkers blown apart. The Allies were inside Germany, advancing rapidly toward the final prize, Berlin. But the cost had been monumental. Thousands of young men had died in the mud of the Hürtgen, the snows of the Ardennes, the rubble of Aachen, and the ancient streets of Trier. Entire towns had vanished under fire, and the war, though nearing its conclusion, still had horrors left to reveal for Patton, for the Third Army, and for the countless divisions that had battered against the Siegfried Line for months on end. The crossing of the Rhine was more than a military milestone. It was the moment they knew the fortress had been broken. The Reich was in retreat, and victory was no longer a dream. It was inevitable. The thunder of war was finally fading. By the spring of 1945, Allied boots were grinding into the heart of Germany through scorched cities and cratered countryside. The Siegfried Line had been breached. The Rhineland, the symbolic and strategic barrier of the Reich, had been crossed. And yet, for all the triumph that followed the bloody campaigns through Hürtgen, Aachen, Trier, and beyond, a more subtle and longer-lasting consequence was already unfolding, one not measured by miles advanced or fortifications shattered, but by borders drawn, flags raised, and ideologies set on a collision course. Because in the months the Allies spent clawing through the western defenses of Nazi Germany, another army was moving in from the east, and it would get to Berlin first. The Western Allies had paid dearly for every step forward. Their path had been slow, deliberate, and often fragmented by competing strategies. Operation Market Garden had cost them vital momentum. The Ardennes offensive had bled their ranks during the worst winter in memory. The Siegfried Line, once dismissed as outdated, had proved stubbornly resilient, eating up weeks of brutal fighting and thousands of lives. By the time Patton's forces crossed the Rhine and Montgomery began his push into northern Germany, the Soviet Red Army was already storming across Poland and pressing hard through East Prussia, Silesia, and into Saxony. To the east, the Soviets fought with terrifying ferocity and unmatched speed. They had suffered unimaginably at the hands of the Germans during the early years of the war. Tens of millions dead, entire cities razed, and now they sought retribution with fire and steel. Stalin's commanders, hardened by years of attrition, siege, and scorched earth defense, had learned how to wield mechanized warfare with devastating effect. Their offensive was relentless, and their aim was clear: Berlin. As Allied generals squabbled over post-Rhine strategy, as supply chains were stretched, and as American and British forces diverted resources to secure the Ruhr and southern Germany, the Soviets pressed ahead with singular focus. By mid-April, their forces were at the gates of Berlin. The city, already hollowed by bombings and manned by a desperate mix of Wehrmacht remnants, Hitler Youth, and civilian volunteers, would face the full weight of Stalin's revenge. There had been discussions tense and cautious about who would take Berlin. At the Yalta Conference earlier that year, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin had outlined a framework for the post-war order. Zones of occupation were agreed upon, including a shared occupation of Berlin itself. But the question of who would physically take the city was left unsettled. Eisenhower, wary of overextending and wanting to avoid unnecessary casualties, chose not to prioritize a dash for Berlin. For him, the war needed to end, not be prolonged in a race for a ruined capital. Patton, of course, argued otherwise. He believed he could be in Berlin within days. But the High Command made its choice, and it would be the Soviets who claimed the final, terrible prize. On May 2, 1945, Berlin fell. Red Army flags flew over the Reichstag. Hitler was dead by his own hand, and the last defenders of Nazi Germany had either surrendered, been captured, or were killed. A week later, Germany formally capitulated. The war in Europe was over. But even as the guns fell silent, a new and colder kind of battle began. When Soviet troops entered Berlin, they brought with them not only victory, but occupation. Stalin wasted no time consolidating control over Eastern Europe. Territories liberated by the Red Army quickly found themselves under its shadow. Communist regimes sprang up in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany, installed and protected by Moscow. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill would soon call it, descended not with a clash of armies, but with quiet arrests, propaganda, and secret police. The Western Allies, exhausted and grieving, found themselves staring across a divided continent. What had begun as a joint effort to crush fascism had ended, with Europe carved into ideological spheres, democracy in the West, totalitarianism in the East. And the months spent battering the Siegfried Line, suffering in the Hürtgen forest, and fighting house to house in Trier had played their part in this outcome. Had the Allies moved faster, had Berlin been taken by American or British forces, the map of Europe might have looked very different. Instead, the long delay in breaching Germany's western defenses gave the Soviets just enough time to position themselves as the dominant power in Eastern Europe. When the Cold War began, its front lines were not theoretical. They ran along rivers where tanks had once crossed, through forests where infantry had once bled, and into the bombed-out ruins of a capital divided not just by politics but by history. Berlin itself became the symbol of this new conflict. In the West, the British, French, and Americans administered their sectors with a mix of caution and hope. In the East, the Soviets transformed their zone into a tightly controlled outpost of Moscow. Families were split, communications severed, and a wall, first of ideology, then of concrete, was erected through the war. Heart of the city, the scars of war did not heal. They hardened. And so the struggle to break the Siegfried Line, to cross the Rhine, and to finally bring down the Nazi regime, while triumphant in its end, left behind a paradox. The Allies had won the war, but in doing so, and in the time it had taken to break through, they had lost the race for influence in the East. A new war began, almost immediately not fought with tanks and mortars, but with spies, threats, missiles, and proxy battles on faraway soil. The Cold War was born not just from ideology, but from timing, from choices made in the mud of the Ardennes and the ruins of Aachen, from the decision to hold back in Berlin and avoid another bloodbath, from the shadows of a campaign that had been both victorious and costly beyond measure. The battle to break the Siegfried Line ended with flags waving and troops marching through towns once thought unreachable. But its true legacy was not merely military. It reshaped the world. It drew lines on maps that would harden into walls. And it taught a generation that even in victory the future was uncertain, and peace would never come without a price. They say war is measured not just in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the weight of its human cost, the pain etched into the hearts of those who lived through it, and the silence left by those who never returned. Nowhere was this more true than in the brutal campaign against the Siegfried Line. For months, the Allied forces had hurled themselves against concrete bunkers, steel-reinforced pillboxes, tangled forests, minefields, and relentless German resistance. From the frozen depths of the Hürtgen forest to the fire-swept streets of Aachen and Trier, the campaign became a slow, grinding testament to endurance, discipline, and sacrifice. Young men, barely old enough to vote, charged through fog and fire, often with no more than a compass, a rifle, and the orders to hold the line or take that hill. Thousands of them would never return home. Others did, but were forever changed by the cold, the fear, the screaming metal of mortar shells, and the things they saw their friends endure. The Siegfried Line was not just a wall of stone and steel, it was a wall of will. And breaking it inch by inch cost more than any strategist or commander could have predicted. The casualty list grew longer with every failed assault, every misjudged order, every night spent pinned under machine gun fire. Entire companies vanished in minutes. Mines and booby traps claimed men long after battles ended. Forests, once lush and green, became graveyards of twisted metal and splintered trees. Even today, parts of the line remain untouched, marked only by rusted helmets, scarred earth, and silent monuments to the fallen. For the soldiers of the Bloody Bucket Division, for the tank crews of Patton's Third Army, for the engineers who cleared mines by hand, and the medics who dragged the wounded through mud and gunfire, the memory of the Siegfried Line would never fade. They were not chasing glory. They were fighting so the war could end, so that tyranny would fall, so that cities could rise again in peace. The legacy of this campaign extends far beyond the battlefield. It shaped the post-war world. It gave birth to stories of courage, loss, and resilience that still echo through the families of those who fought. It taught us the price of freedom. And perhaps most importantly, it left behind a warning that even when walls fall and guns go silent, the scars remain. Today, remnants of the Siegfried Line still stand weathered, moss-covered, half swallowed by forests and fields. Some have been turned into museums. Others remain untouched, slowly crumbling under the weight of time and memory. They are quiet now, but if you stand among them long enough, you can still feel it. The tension in the air, the ghosts in the fog, the echo of boots marching toward the unknown. To everyone who has joined us on this journey through one of the most grueling and forgotten campaigns of World War II, thank you. Thank you for listening, for remembering, and for honoring those who gave so much in a place history almost tried to forget. If this story moved you, if it taught you something new, or if you believe these stories must be preserved, please consider subscribing to our channel, leaving a like, and sharing this video. It means the world to us, and it helps ensure these powerful chapters of history reach more people around the globe. And as we close the book on this chapter on the mud, the blood, the fire, and the fury of the Siegfried Line, we are reminded that history is not just something that happened. It is something that shaped us. It is something we carry forward. Take a deep breath. Hug your loved ones. And as the world sleeps, may you find peace in the knowledge that the freedom we enjoy today was paid for in full by those who fought through hell to secure it. Thank you again for watching. And until next time, sleep well and good night.